Belarus, it's just a Russian military base masquerading as a country, right? Well, not so fast. Just recently, President Lukashenko warned any attempt to force us into Russia would mean war. This might sound shocking, but he's actually balanced on a tightrope for years, often keeping his distance from Moscow, although threatening war is certainly a new one. So, while Belarus might look like just another arm of Russia today, what if I told you it wasn't always this way? And guess what? It was once Belarus that almost annexed Russia.
President of Belarus Alexander Lukashenko said that the Federation would have to prepare for a response to the attempt to occupy Belarus.
Vladimir Putin has been tightening his hold over Belarus, and with the two countries targeted by sanctions over the Ukraine war, Russian dominance is only set to grow.
Armored personnel carriers are transported towards the border with Ukraine. The south of Belarus looks like a Russian military zone.
Just a few years ago, Lukashenko would never have allowed Russia using Belarus as a doormat like it does today. In just 2020, Lukashenko was actively flirting with NATO, welcoming US hawks like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton to Minsk, and firmly denying Russia's request to set up an airbase. British Royal Marines even trained in Belarus that year. It's a recent past that seems almost impossible given today's events. Fast forward to 2022 and Russian boots are stomping all over Belarus, using the country as a launchpad for assaults on Kiev. We'll get to how this happened later, but first, to make it worse for Belarusian hopes for independence, in 2023, a leaked strategy document from Putin's office, published by Yahoo News, exposed Russia's long-term plan to fully absorb Belarus, aiming to turn it into a loyal satellite by 2030. Under the guise of the Union State, the Kremlin has mapped out steps to pull Belarus's 9.3 million, mostly Russian-speaking people, firmly into its sphere.
Alexander Lukashenko said that it is impossible to seize other people's territories as it's not the Middle Ages now. Lukashenko also noted that he did not understand why Belarus should join Russia, as the countries already cooperate within the Union State.
The strategy: political control, economic domination, and military integration, without Belarus ever formally surrendering its independence. And what is the Union State, you ask? Think of it as an open relationship proposal that's been on the table since 1999, promising closer political and economic ties while keeping each country's independence. So why did Lukashenko agree to it? Well, the merging of the two countries seemed like a backdoor to possibly take control of both Belarus and Russia in the longer term, given how weak and unpopular and visibly dying Russian President Boris Yeltsin was. In the short term, the Union State deal gave Belarus access to cheap, subsidized Russian products, especially fossil fuels, which helped Lukashenko stabilize the economy and build a unique, semi-Soviet, semi-socialist state. It was almost like running the country as a giant collective farm, much like the one he once directed under the USSR. And yes, this Belarusian model came complete with its own state-sponsored beauty pageants, free from foreign competition and personally overseen by Lukashenko himself. British journalist Peter Hitchens, who visited in 2008, described it as a Soviet Union that has, unlike the original, learned how to clean its windows and worked out how to make fridges that don't shudder all day, lifts that don't lurch, and lorries that can move without emitting plumes of oily brown smoke. Still, by 2018, Belarus's GDP per capita was triple Ukraine's. Though Lukashenko succeeded at home, his dreams of expanding his influence took a hit when Putin came to power in 2000, young, healthy, and popular. Any hopes of quietly annexing Russia disappeared, and Lukashenko found himself walking a tightrope, holding on to Belarus's independence while still squeezing good deals out of Moscow. But now the tables have turned. Russia is using the Union State model as its own backdoor plan to quietly absorb Belarus, turning it into a puppet state where independence is little more than a label. Politically and militarily aligned with Moscow, Belarus is drifting closer to becoming a Russian satellite. Back in 2019, Lukashenko even claimed Belarus could unite with Russia tomorrow, no problem, a stark contrast to his recent warnings about war with Russia. Confused? You're not alone. Lukashenko has often continued flirting with deeper unification, only to pull back when it threatens Belarusian independence. The reason is that he appeases Moscow just enough to keep his leverage, all while stopping short of giving up Belarus's sovereignty entirely, resulting in these often contradictory statements. However, this leaked 17-page strategy paper shows Russia's ambitions for Belarus have become more serious and is no longer tolerating any back and forth from Lukashenko. Written by the Presidential Directorate for Cross-Border Cooperation and shaped by powerful agencies like the FSB, SVR, GUR, and Russia's General Staff, the plan aligns Belarus's future entirely with Russian interests, from harmonizing Belarusian laws to fostering pro-Russian sentiments in its military and political elite. The document calls for a shared currency system, likely a ruble takeover, and directs Belarusian industries to prioritize Russian trade. Even Belarus's nuclear reactor, funded by Russia, would be folded into a power-sharing scheme under Moscow's control. For Belarusians, this dependency isn't just economic. It means sacrificing self-directed growth as industries, agriculture, and even education come under Russian influence, dismantling Lukashenko's unique economic system. Currently, 45% of Belarusian exports go to Russia, with 90% of its oil and gas also coming from there, leaving Belarus vulnerable to Russian price swings and trade wars. A temporary oil supply cut in 2020 underscored this reliance.
Russia has stopped oil deliveries to its neighbor Belarus after the two countries failed to agree on terms for this year's supply contract. Belarus state-owned energy firm confirmed the news Friday. It said Moscow suspended all crude oil supplies as of January 1st, and the suspension will stay in place until the contract dispute is resolved.
Although Belarus hoped the Astrovets nuclear power plant might lessen its energy dependence, political issues with EU neighbors have made it difficult to find customers for Belarusian electricity. Likewise, when Moscow doesn't perceive Minsk as playing ball, it decides to restrict Belarusian imports over supposed food safety issues, leaving Belarus scrambling. This vulnerability led Belarus to hatch a 30-30-30 plan, a dream to spread exports evenly across Russia, the EU, and Asia. But it hasn't been smooth sailing. Productivity struggles in state-owned enterprises and EU trade restrictions keep that dream a bit distant.
After hours of talks, EU leaders broke a diplomatic deadlock Friday and imposed sanctions on Belarus. The deal on sanctions against about 40 officials accused of rigging August's presidential election.
The milk wars began in the late 2000s and have flared up multiple times since. Each time, Russia restricts imports to give its own dairy producers a leg up against Belarus's cheaper, high-quality milk. For Belarus, these bans are a huge hit since dairy is such a crucial export and Russia is the main buyer, despite trying to expand to Asian and Middle Eastern markets. Belarus's exports are split pretty clearly between Russia and the EU. Russia gets a mixed bag: food, textiles, electronics, and machinery, while the EU mostly imports oil, petrochemicals, timber, and metals, a lot of which originally come from Russia anyway. But here's where it gets interesting. Services are actually a bright spot for Belarus, with nearly half going to the EU and a decent chunk to the US, thanks in part to the high-tech park launched back in 2006. China's also stepping in, mainly importing Belarusian dairy and timber. Still, even with these new trade partners, Belarus remains deeply tied to Russia, navigating a web of economic and political dependencies that only gets more tangled. Beyond economics, the most alarming part of Russia's plan is its military vision for Belarus. The goal? Total coordination of foreign and defense policies, turning Belarus into an outright military extension of Russia. Under the Union state, Russia wants to set up permanent air defense systems, weapons depots, and a unified command structure that puts Belarusian forces under Moscow's control. This would make Belarus a buffer zone, where Russian forces could intercept NATO missiles from Poland, Latvia, or Lithuania, essentially making Belarus a front line in Russia's standoff with NATO. It's a setup that risks Belarusian sovereignty and drags its citizens into Russia's military agenda.
Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko is set to hold talks with Vladimir Putin today. The meeting comes as Russia's closest European ally says it may start hosting nuclear weapons.
In a speech at the All Belarusian People's Assembly, Lukashenko confirmed that several dozen Russian nukes are now stationed in Belarus. Soon after, Russia and Belarus launched high-stakes military drills, moving from basic nuclear prep to training with battlefield nukes. Russia's defense ministry claims it's about protecting the alliance's sovereignty, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov citing Europe's tense climate and provocations from the US and its allies. Russia's annexation strategy goes beyond politics and the military, extending into what it calls the humanitarian sphere, a plan to reshape Belarusian identity to align with Russian narratives. This includes doubling the number of Belarusian students in Russian universities and opening Russian cultural centers to foster loyalty. The document also proposes pro-Russian NGOs to promote Moscow's view of history and culture, essentially steering Belarusian society to fit Russia's imperial vision. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the Belarusian opposition leader now living in exile, calls the Union State a roadmap for the absorption of Belarus by Russia. She warns that once Belarus is fully integrated, returning to democracy will be nearly impossible. This is not a union of equals, she says. It's a one-sided takeover. But while we might now see Western-backed Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya as Lukashenko's arch-nemesis, things looked very different just before the 2020 elections. In fact, Lukashenko was openly clashing with the Kremlin, accusing Russia, not the West, of meddling and puppeteering, jailing pro-Kremlin politicians, and even arresting 33 Wagner Group operatives on a charge of plotting a coup. Belarus and Russia's special friendship was on the rocks, a bit of a contrast to today, when Wagner is calling Belarus home after its exile from Russia proper. Clearly, things can change in an instant, and in August 2020, they did. A massive Western-backed protest movement erupted, pushing for Lukashenko's removal. Suddenly, he was backed into a corner, buried under EU and US sanctions, and with nowhere else to turn. Desperate to keep his grip on power, he ran straight to Putin. And Putin, after months of watching from the sidelines, was ready to cut a deal. For the first time in their 20-year frenemy relationship, Lukashenko had to give Putin everything he wanted, and just like that, Belarus was locked into Russia's orbit. And as the war in Ukraine dragged on, Belarus's role as a silent but crucial player has only intensified. But here's a big question: would Belarusians actually resist a Russian takeover? Ukraine's war has given us some clues about what Moscow might face. Just hours after Russia's full-scale invasion, a Belarusian hacktivist group called the Cyber Partisans sprang into action. As Dom Kovavel of BNE Telenews and the Kiev Independent reported, they formed the Tactical Group of Belarus, teaming up with Ukrainian hackers to take on their shared enemy, Putin. Likewise, other partisan groups have carried out around 80 acts of sabotage, mainly setting fire to railway signals, which forces trains to slow to 15 to 20 km per hour, disrupting Russian military logistics. Meanwhile, a Belarusian volunteer regiment called Kastus Kalinowski joined Ukrainian forces on the front lines against Russia. Sure, these bold moves show that grassroots opposition to Russia influence is alive in Belarus, but let's keep it real. The regiment only has about 300 soldiers. Most Belarusians, including Lukashenko supporters, may not love the war against Ukraine, but they've largely tolerated Russian forces using Belarus as a base. For years, Belarus under Lukashenko maintained a fragile independence, balancing Russian support without ceding full control. But burning bridges with the West has forced Belarus closer to Moscow, giving Russia more opportunities to tighten its grip. Lukashenko may be tough and wily, but he's also aging, and there's no guarantee his successor will have the same skill to walk this tightrope. Putin's vision for a renewed Russian empire looms large, seeing Belarus as territory to reclaim, not a true ally. With Belarus's growing military, economic and social dependence, how long before it's simply another autonomous republic of the Russian Federation?